specifically speaking to the pre-K measurement tool for this webinar, though some of the things that we will be sharing with you also relate to the toddler tool. But since most of you are pre-K trainers, we're going to stick with that one particular measure. So our objectives are to have you gain a deeper understanding of the process and intent of the training videos and discussions that you use in observation training. Also, to recognize the most common coding errors that trainees make while you're conducting training. To identify the best strategies for dealing with coding errors. And to know how and when to use your resources. So some of our goals for pre-K observation training include help my trainees pass the test. No, not really. What we really want to do is to help participants learn and understand the class measure. We would like for that to be able to train the participants to code reliably. We also want to prepare the participants to use live observations out in the field. Some things you're going to need to know really well are the class dimensions. You're going to need to know about Chapter 2 in your pre-K class manual. So hopefully you're very familiar with that and you know where to go when you run into questions in the training. You'll also need to know the master code justifications. Those master code justifications are really important as you introduce the videos and lead your discussions around those. And so you need to know how to use those and how the justifications are written. Also, you also need to know the common errors that trainees make, and they're pretty easy to pick up on if you are a sensitive trainer and you're watching your trainees to see how they're doing and watching how they're coding and the kind of questions and answers that you have for them. And then also you're going to look for appropriate ways to redirect inaccurate comments. Don't be afraid to tell somebody that they have inaccurately identified a dimension or an indicator where the interaction best fits. This is a part of the training, and what you're trying to do is help them understand how to use the tool. The trick is how you tell them. You want to validate that you also observe the interaction and explain that it best fits in another indicator or dimension. If it's early in the training, for instance, you're still introducing the dimensions, you can just say that it belongs in a dimension you haven't discussed yet. But if you have introduced all the dimensions, you can ask that person to look at the face page to see where the interaction fits, or ask the entire group to identify the correct indicator or dimension. And it's helpful to focus on that definition. I'm going to review the coding process. Okay, so what we do when we're coding is we train our observer participants to watch and take notes, and we know that that can be a problem for them, so we have to really scaffold how to take notes and how to watch a video and pay attention to the observable behaviors that tell us how effective interactions are. And then we help them sort interactions into the correct dimension and indicator. The next piece of the coding process is to weigh that evidence and assign a preliminary range for each indicator based on the face pages for each dimension. From that point, you verify the range by looking at your detail or descriptive pages following the face page. An important piece is to look for the next best fit or disconfirming evidence when you're deciding which range is going to be your best fit. No range is a perfect fit, so you need to find the one that matches the best. Once you've determined if that's low, mid, or high range, you're going to assign that code based on the scoring guidelines. Ultimately, you have to consider the definition when you score and think holistically. I'm going to turn over to Sarah Hatton now, and she's going to review the training videos and what the purpose for each one of those is.
Okay, thank you, Mary Margaret, and welcome everybody. I'm glad you could join us. So as you know, there are 5 training videos, and if you've trained a fair amount, you know which order they come in. And the reason I mention that is that they're in that order for a very specific reason. I like to say that there is method to the madness, and that each video was carefully selected and put in order to demonstrate key aspects of the training. So you really want to go ahead and make sure that you follow that order. So the first video, Counting Fruits and Veggies, the purpose of that video is to introduce observing and note-taking across those 10 dimensions. As we recall, up until that point, people have simply been looking for interactions in the different dimensions as you introduce the dimensions, but in this video we pull it all together. And as you know from training, that can be a challenging task for some people. So they observe and take notes across the 10 dimensions, and then you're going to help them use the face page for each dimension to assign ranges. We don't go into full-fledged coding at this point. We really just want to get people used to taking notes and thinking about the 10 different domains and the range piece. Okay? Then our second video is making butterflies. The purpose of this, and actually let me also back up, counting fruits and veggies is also a fairly high range video, and so it's easier for people to code. And so it's there in that first slot because we want people, trainees, to feel confident and that they can master this material. So there's also rationale for having it first. Making butterflies, as you all know from your own training, is a little bit more difficult for a variety of reasons. And so one of the things that we want people to do here is to fine-tune their note-taking. So you're really continuing to scaffold the note-taking. They'll use dimension face page and the detail and descriptive pages at this point. So you're adding another step. Making butterflies is also a little bit more challenging for folks, so it's nice to put in a little bit of a challenge right at that point. The third video, cards and letter stamping, we very intentionally put that in because it shows two different teachers. It was not in the original lineup of training videos for observation training, but we got feedback from participants that they wanted more experience in the training doing that. And I'm hearing that it's hard to understand, so I apologize, and I will try again. And unfortunately, I don't know what the last thing anybody heard was, so I'm just going to move on. So cards and letter stamping, the third video, was selected because it allows us to code a classroom with two teachers, which is often what we see when we go out into the field. It's also a little bit easier again, so it's nice at that point to have that going on. We're continuing to have people fine-tune their note-taking, and at this point we're walking around the room looking at people's notes, and when we're discussing the video we're certainly saying, what have you written down? Tell me what you saw. Okay, and so the question was around making butterflies. Making butterflies, our purpose here is to continue to fine-tune note-taking. And we've moved on from simply looking at the face page to assign ranges to also using that face page, but then going to the detail and those descriptive pages to look for the confirmatory evidence or to disconfirm and think about if we need to look at the next best fit.
This is Mary Margaret. I just want to chime in on making butterflies. You know that often people want to code negative climate a lot higher than the master code is, and that's a really good exercise in taking a look at the definition, really looking at what the indicators say for teacher negativity, and it's a very big moment for folks when they realize that a lot of the things that they're wanting to put under negative climate are actually captured in other dimensions. So it's a very powerful video.
Okay, sounds like we answered the, or took care of that problem, and I do apologize. I'll try to sit closer to the speaker. Our fourth video is Letters and Book Review, and Letters and Book Review, one of the key things it does is it really helps capture bias and helps us refocus on the definitions of each dimension. If we were sitting together in a room, I'd ask for a show of hands of how many people had difficulty with that video during their own training and how many of you wanted to not necessarily give credit for some of the good things that are going on in that classroom. And so even though we definitely see some negative climate and we definitely see some lack of connectedness between the teacher and the students, some lack of regard, and some other things, we have to acknowledge, for example, that it's an extremely productive classroom. Because if we go back and look at that definition of productivity and we look at the indicators, it's really fitting there. So again, help us capture bias because it happens quite a bit with this video. And then moving on to the last video, which is playing with paper. I'm going to just remind you that you are continuing to scaffold your trainees' note-taking. You're continuing to walk around the room and see what kinds of things they have written down. And ideally, by this time, we've moved people onto the score sheet because that's what they'll really need out in the field. One of the things that playing with paper does is it demonstrates the halo effect. If you remember the video or have trained on it recently, you'll remember that this is a teacher who's very strong in emotional support, and classroom organization is strong as well. Instructional support is not as strong in this video, and people tend to want to code it too high. And so some of that truly is the halo effect. So we have to go back with our trainees and have them focus back on the definitions and think about the fact that each dimension is distinct and that we can't let what happens with one dimension impact the other. The other thing playing with paper does is it helps us check for coder fatigue, because as we all know, by this point in the training, the trainees are exhausted, and it helps us drive home the point that you really don't want to take your test all in the same day. And finally, it emphasizes the need to study for the test. Okay. So we have strategies for addressing coding errors, and these are generic strategies that will work across any of the dimensions and will certainly work if you are a toddler trainer or if you are a K-3 trainer. And then after we do this, we'll move into some specific dimension-related strategies using the pre-K videos as examples. So our first strategy is to remain objective. And you all know that, but it's really hard for people to do, especially folks who are new to the class. And that's where we have to step back as trainers and remember that this was difficult for us in the beginning as well, and where we have to remind people to check their biases and to take off their speech-language pathology hat or their language and literacy hat and put on their class lens. As I mentioned earlier, keeping those dimensions separate. We know that dimensions can impact each other. So for example, a classroom that is low in productivity is probably also going to have problems with behavior management. A classroom that is high in instructional learning formats is less likely to have problems with behavior management because the teacher is working to facilitate activities so the students are engaged. Nonetheless, we have to score them separately. A third strategy is to keep those single incidents in perspective. Remember that we're always looking at the average experience of the average child, and something that happened to one child is not going to weigh too heavily unless there are only 4 kids in the video, and then obviously there is greater weight. The other thing to think about with those single incidents is to not let something that happened in the very beginning of the video impact you too much, such as in letters and book review, when one of the first things the teacher says is, get that goo-goo look off your face. It could cause some people to have a negative sense for the teacher, but again, keep it in perspective, and it's only one thing. A fourth thing is to avoid seeking perfection. The class is a 7-point scale. The score of 7 does not mean it's perfect. It means that we as observers are seeing consistent, effective interactions related to that dimension across that observation cycle. And then finally, the last strategy to think about to help your trainees is to keep each cycle independent. And I know that I have oftentimes had people overcode cards and letter stamping because it's just so much better than the Making Butterflies teacher. And so when they think in comparison, they're using the teachers as comparisons to one another. But we don't do that. We have to start each dimension clearly. Okay, and there was a request to repeat the 5th point. Go ahead, Mary Margaret.
Okay. So I'll step in. Thank you, Sarah. All of these addressing coding errors actually fall in Chapter 2 in your manual. So if you happen to have your PK manual with you, it starts on page 12. And again, I mentioned earlier that having a good knowledge of Chapter 2 and when to go to Chapter 2 is going to be a huge help to you. So remaining objective is the first section of challenges for the observer. And I find that one of the most important pieces of that section is actually the last paragraph where it talks about remaining objective and tendency to develop initial impressions. I found this to be extremely important when you're training people so that they do look for disconfirming evidence to really help them recognize their bias. Also, when Sarah was mentioning the difference between Making Butterflies and cards and letter stamping, again, that's another reason why those videos are put in that certain order. It's because we want to make sure that people don't compare it to what happens in another video, or if they're in live coding, that you don't compare one cycle to the next. You simply code what happens in that 20 minutes without thinking about anything else. Something else I tell people when I'm training them is that we're looking at a single video while we're trying to calibrate our understanding of the tool. But we know that the research tells us that we need to do a cycle of 4 to get a really clear understanding of what's going on in the classroom. So just to follow along then, the keeping dimensions separate is called independence of cycles in Chapter 2. It starts on the bottom of page 12 and goes over to page 13. Weighing single incidents is on page 13. Seeking perfection is actually on page 14. And then the independence of dimensions is on page 13. I hope that answered your question. We're going to just check the chat box and see if there's any questions. There aren't any. Okay, good. So we're going to move on now to talk about common coding errors with positive climate. So much of the time when people misscore on positive climate, they score too low. If you see a teacher who's not very positive, for instance, not connected emotionally or not smiling very much or not enthusiastic, you may automatically be thinking that she's going to score low. However, much of the time, these kinds of teachers do score in the mid-range because we usually see some of the indicators present at some level. So try to give credit where credit is due and don't overlook the good things that she does do. Again, this is the class lens. It's not what we decide is positive or negative, but it's what the research has told us are indications of effective interactions. Observers sometimes think that there's a low score on positive climate just because they think the teacher's not likable. Again, that's bias, and we have to learn how to recognize that and deal with it. It's a subjective judgment, and we have to really avoid scoring on that basis. So if an observer has an emotional reaction to something a teacher does or says, the observer needs to be very specific in class language about what they're seeing and try to really be objective in considering where it can be measured. Just about everything that people react to, everything that they notice in an observation really does have a place to fit somewhere on the class measure, but not everything, but most everything is if you help them see that there's a place to put that and they just have to figure out where it fits in our definitions of the measure, it's really helpful for them. Also, when people sometimes confuse respect under positive climate with regard under regard for child perspectives. Sometimes it is respectful to follow a child's lead or give them a choice, but what we're doing with Positive Climate is focusing on social etiquette and cooperation. So for each coding error, we always want to remember to look at both Chapter 2 of the manual and the overarching definition. I'll turn Negative Climate over to Sarah.
You would give me negative climate.
Yes, I would.
Okay, we're just kidding. We're just kidding. So common coding errors for negative climate. One of the things we often see is if the teacher is showing any negativity at all, coders will overscore. You need to keep the negativity in perspective and remember that to score higher than a 3, the negative climate really has to be quite bad. Some negativity will lead to a 2 or a 3 score, and in fact, because there's not a score of 0, you can also see a little bit of negativity and code a 1. But to score in the mid or upper mid-range, you really need to see negativity in 3 of the 4 indicators. And when you do see it, you need to ask yourself about the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of that negativity. And remembering that, that the frequency, quality, and intensity of peer negativity are really key here. The other thing that you need to think about is, unlike the other dimensions where our face page will tell us at the low range we see very little, at the mid range we see some, and at the high range we see a fair amount, with the indicator of severe negativity there are no instances at the low or at the mid range. So that's a little bit different. Another thing people tend to do regarding negativity is that they allow negativity to impact their scores in other dimensions. So again, going back to that independence of the dimensions. Negativity falls under negative climate, but if we're not seeing that's not the same as positive climate, teacher sensitivity, or regard. So remember, each dimension is coded separately. Finally, it's important to recognize that the behavioral marker of disconnected/escalating negativity is described to the teacher's negativity. And it's not the same thing as having a disconnected affect. Disconnected affect, a lack of matched affect, falls under positive climate. Being emotionally, I'm sorry, let me start over, I was distracted. Emotional disconnection would be measured under positive climate, as I said, and that lack of matched affect. Disconnected and /escalating refers to a situation where the teacher's negativity is disconnected from external events. In other words, she gets angry for no particular reason. She's looking for something to be angry about, and we often see it disconnected. And we can think back to the letters and book review video where the teacher is getting increasingly irritated, and we as observers are sitting there wondering what on earth these children are doing and why is she sending Ryan to timeout for the 4th time. So now Mary Margaret is going to talk about teacher sensitivity and the common coding errors we see there.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so thinking of teacher sensitivity and really thinking about what does that mean, we're looking at the teacher and how sensitive a teacher is to a child's needs or problems. And sometimes people get that a little bit wrapped up with regard. So when you're thinking of teacher sensitivity, it's important that we have to think about what does the definition say. It's about awareness and responsiveness to needs. So does the teacher notice? Does she care about it? And does she do something? And when she does, is it done in a way that is helping the child? So sometimes it might be just they need their shoe tied, or they might need a little of attention. And if the teacher responds to that, that is being a responsive teacher. Often when we see a teacher who responds insensitively, they might score in the mid-range even because at least there was some response. So we have to see if there's some response, if there's some awareness. It can't be considered low if with the absence of other indicators. If it's not uncommon for folks to mix up that regard and teacher sensitivity, and so you really need to think, like if a teacher tells children to sit on your bottoms, it's a restriction of movement, which we have under regard. But if the children are not clearly uncomfortable, then she's just telling them to sit on their bottoms, that's something under regard, but if they're not uncomfortable, it's not a need or a problem for those children. So again, you have to look at the children's behavior. You can't just assume that a child needs to move or take a turn unless it's communicated in some way by the children. And then move on back to Sarah for regard.
For regard. Okay. Remember, for regard for student perspectives, that this dimension is about how much autonomy children are given and how controlling versus child-oriented the teacher is. If the activities are all teacher-directed, but you see some instances of following their lead choices, and there are some things that kids can do from themselves, you're often going to see a mid-range score. And oftentimes, folks will just not want to give any credit at all, but again, if you want to give some credit for that. The only time we see low-range scores with regard are when the teacher is very controlling. She doesn't let them choose anything or do anything for themselves. I call that the my way or the highway teacher. Okay? And as we mentioned before, it's easy to mix up regard with the other emotional support dimensions, so you need to be clear about it, and you need to feel really comfortable redirecting your trainees so that they have a good understanding of the dimension. It's tempting to dismiss teacher-directed or teacher control when we see it, especially if the teacher is very kind and positive, or we see real intentionality in her teaching. So what we always have to do is ask ourselves, could the teacher have let the children do more for himself? Did the teacher have an agenda? And if so, did she persist with it despite the children's cues to the contrary? Quite often, observers will place too much weight upon single incidences, for example, not giving children a choice about where to play. We need to discuss with trainees the fact that there are times of the day for children when they do not get to choose what they will be doing. Some activities and routines are non-negotiable. So we have to think within the context of required activities, does the teacher follow the leads? Does she show flexibility about how the routine is carried out? And one really good example of this is in playing with paper, when in the very beginning, the teacher starts to ask kids where they want to play, and then she tells a whole group of kids that they have to go to the art table. And so people frequently code down on regard because of this. And so then we have to go back and say, yes, it's true, she told this group of kids where to go to play, but once they got there, they were free to come and go. They could create whatever they wanted. They could move about. So we need to keep the whole dimension in perspective. Okay? So we're finishing with emotional support, and Mary Margaret's going to move into...
This is Caroline. Someone has reported that they can't hear us, but I just want to see if that's just maybe on their end or if anyone else can hear us. Okay.
Okay, and this is Sarah. I also see there's a question. Oh, thank you for all the people who can hear.
Yay!
Yay!
And we're
Yay!
sorry for
We
that
feel so
person.
much better.
But yes, we're sorry to who cannot hear us.
So for the person who can't hear, they can't hear. So
We'll be able to record.
we're recording it.
Oh, right.
And so I was going to say, there's also a question, is there a handout to print out? The answer is no, but we're recording and we will be posting it to
The affiliate blog.
the affiliate blog. And while Mary Margaret starts talking about behavior management, Caroline, can you type in that we are recording this so that they can get it later? Thank you.
I'm going to let Caroline type while we're not moving forward to the next slide yet. But when you're thinking about classroom organization, remember that we're talking about the management of time. And essentially, is there any time lost? So is there time lost because the children don't know how to behave? Or is there time wasted during transitions, during activity, et cetera? So now, going back to behavior management, some of the things that you have to do is you're forgetting to look at the student behavior, which is an important piece of behavior management. In fact, on the bottom of page 44, where you have behavior management, it does talk about the children's behavior, being able to, if the children make no mistakes in behavior, then you could code high. So if you want to make sure that you look at the bottom of page 44. The other thing is that you might be dismissing some student behavior because of the classroom circumstances. So you're looking at, the children are well behaved because they're scared of the teacher. Well, we're looking, are the children well behaved, or making assumptions about that. So, for instance, in letters and book review, the children are pretty well behaved, but we definitely capture their lack of engagement and lack of connection in many other ways. But in terms of having to spend time managing behavior, there was some time spent, but it wasn't a lot. So we need to make sure that is it taking away from learning time. Okay, and now we're ready for productivity.
Okay, so when we think about productivity, one of the things to remember is that productivity is only about the use of time, all right? And the common mistakes people make are to let other things factor into their coding. We need to be completely objective about this dimension. You can't consider the quality or the efficacy, the meaningfulness of the activity. I'm not sure that's a real word. But it really goes back to that footnote on the bottom of page 49 of your manual, which is that productivity ratings should not consider the quality of instruction or student engagement. It's not that we don't think those things are important. They're critically important in the preschool classroom. But what we are capturing here in productivity is really whether or not the teacher is providing activities for the children. Okay? So even if the teacher's positive climate sensitivity, regard, and behavior management are low, productivity can still be quite high. So I have to take you back then to making butterflies, which is a highly productive segment. There's not a whole lot going on in terms of emotional support, but the teacher has given them something to do the majority of the time. The children seem to know the routines. She was very prepared. So even though it was a dubious activity, it was productive. And new coders will sometimes also fail to count brief periods of waiting, such as for teacher hand washing or quickly going to get materials. We need to remember that these incidences can add up to significant time lost over the course of the lesson. And so we always need to make the point that any one of these incidences in and of itself would not affect the score, as it would be too brief. But several of them across time do add up enough time that we may be altering the score. At times, coders will also want to overlook disruptions when the actual lesson or activity isn't very good. But what we need to do is stress that any time taken away affects productivity because, again, we're not looking at the quality or the student engagement. And then finally, sometimes people want to give the teachers the benefit of the doubt when it comes to brief disruptions or to slightly unclear instructions, especially if the teacher is very effective in other dimensions. All of us can put ourselves in the teacher's shoes and have empathy for their situation. She's doing the best she can. It's not her fault that she can't find the blocks, or it's not her fault that the phone rang. But what we have to do, again, is be objective, look at our manual, look at the definitions, look at the indicators, look at the face page, and the long-range descriptions. So now I'm going to pass it over to Mary Margaret to talk about instructional learning formats.
Okay, so we're still in the classroom organization domain, so it's about time. And we know that with instructional learning formats, we're looking to see about the children's engagement, interest, and ability to learn from lessons and activities. Thank you. Oops. Now we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so you need to be careful not to mistake participation for engagement. And also when you get around effective questioning, Remember that it's not about how much they're learning, but is the teacher really trying to engage them and focus their attention on the activity or the material. So we have to have a very solid definition of student interest and active participation. And again, you can have your participants go into their manuals looking at that high range to really see what that looks like. When you're looking at facilitation, that behavioral marker of effective questioning is only referring to whether the teacher is effective at getting questions to get the kids to increase engagement, not questions that are about understanding or learning. We're going to get to that in instructional support. This is the clarity of learning objectives sometimes is a problem for folks as well. It's the final indicator discussed. It's been a long day of training, and participants are tired and they gloss over this one without really understanding it. It's important to highlight page 60 so you can really see with the understanding of what constitutes a high level of clarity learning objective. Specifically, for it to be high, the children need to know the point of the lesson. And I like to say that they understand why. They know what they're doing, but they also need to know why. And so it needs to be more explicit. All right, we're going to move on to instructional learning formats.
No.
I'm sorry, I just did that. Instructional support, you think I'd know this. And we're going to go ahead and let Sarah talk about concept development.
All right, thank you, Mary Margaret. So concept development, I know you all know what it's about. So we're really just going to focus on these coding errors. And the first one is overcoding, especially if the teacher is likable. This really is the most common error, and in truth, overcoding is the most common error in the instructional support domain as a whole. We often will see this if the teacher is likable, if emotional support is strong, if classroom organization is strong. We see that overcoding, and as I mentioned when we were talking about playing with paper, it definitely comes into play there. So some things to think about in terms of overscoring are remembering that some analysis and reasoning questions do not automatically put the dimension in the high range. Even frequent analysis and reasoning questions are not enough to warrant a high range scores if you're not seeing the other indicators frequently. We always have to think about depth here because in concept development we are pushing that higher order thinking. So we need to think about depth, whether the teacher gives the children time to think and answer. Depth may have to do with the difficulty level of the questions, how much she pushes the children to think, and whether her efforts result in any new connections being made. So how much is she pushing them to think, and is she getting results? Okay. The depth of CD indicators is also evidenced through teacher intentionality. So we also need to think about connections to the real world and the social conversations. Sometimes observers think that any reference to a child's life outside the classroom counts as a connection to the real world. This isn't the case. There are all sorts of social conversations that aren't pushing higher order thinking. They're just pleasant social conversations. We count them in positive climate as part of building relationships. We'll count them in language modeling under frequent conversation, but not as concept development. Okay. And then another reason people score too high on a dimension is that they factor in questions and activities that are rote. And so just because the teacher is teaching the children something that's a concept, whether it's shapes or colors or sounds or symbols, doesn't mean that she's or he is really promoting concept development. Always go back and ask yourself, did the teacher intentionally push higher order thinking skills? Did she allow the children to think and answer the questions on their own and to come to conclusions on their own? Okay. So Mary Margaret's going to talk about quality of feedback, which is the partner in crime with concept development.
Okay. So again, we tend to see people overcode in quality of feedback. Remember, it's in response to something the child says or does. That doesn't mean that the teacher can't ask a question and respond to something that the child says or does. So it's not automatically triggered. You don't have to wait for a child to say something. It can be part of that development of a concept, if you will. So it's the purpose is to help the child to understand something. So we're looking at that teacher's intent to help that child learn something, use their thinking, or keep persisting at a task. So the depth would mean that it's effective getting the kids to understand, learn, perform, or persist. If you look at quality of feedback like scaffolding, you have to not only note how often you see this, the frequency, but also the teacher's goal, what the results are. And then if you see lower level scaffolding, it could be infrequent or something that doesn't really push thinking or understanding. With providing information, feedback loops, and prompting of thought processes, it's not just enough to have frequency, but it's really depth. Quality means depth. It means going above and beyond just a response. With encouragement and affirmation, this is about really looking at ways to keep the children to persist, and it affirms their effort and more than just a good job. That really fits in, in a positive climate, but not in quality of feedback. So overall, we can see mid-level quality of feedback. We generally see something, but it's either not frequent, or it's not pushing them to think very far, or it's really not helping them persist. So we may see some indicators, but if you look at the definitions and the ranges and then read the detailed descriptors, your coders are going to see that we need to have frequency, depth, and duration. Also, with quality of feedback, we are looking at forgetting that a teacher's comment, again, must be a response to something that a child has said or done. And any comment does not constitute quality of feedback. Just because there's a lot of language doesn't mean that the teacher is necessarily providing a lot of quality, a depth of feedback. So you need to be really careful there. Again, we're looking at, I'm sorry, I missed my slide. Sorry. We're thinking that all feedback must push thought processes. So how is that happening? It's by giving them more information and taking something that you see that they understand or don't understand it and enhancing that knowledge. Also, telling children information is different than providing information. Providing information needs to be related to what that child's response was. Okay, we're going to move on now to language modeling.
Okay. So language modeling, our first common coding error is that overcoding, especially, as we've said before, when a teacher does well in earlier dimensions. That said, there are some people who score concept development and quality feedback low, and they'll automatically assume that language modeling is low as well. And you can't make those assumptions. The only assumption you can make in the class is under behavior management, if all of the children are well behaved and we don't see, so that we don't see those active behaviors, of explaining the rules, the clarity of learning, clarity of expectations, we can assume that they're in place, but it's the only assumption you can make. If you see, if you see some of the low language modeling indicators happening at the same time, you should be thinking about the mid-range. Low-range language modeling scores would be cases where there's very little language going on in the classroom, the teacher is doing most of the talking, and there's no intentionality around getting the children to talk. Remember, language modeling is about facilitating and language stimulation. So we want to hear the children talk. We want the teacher to ask those open-ended questions and give the children the opportunity to respond and not answer them herself. Okay? In order to score in the high range, remember you would need to see the majority of indicators meeting the descriptions for high. At least 3 out of 5 would have to be high for this dimension to score a 6. But again, you need to see not only frequency, but also you need to see that the teacher is intentionally pushing language and that the children are doing a lot of talking. One thing that I've noted over the years is that often people forget to factor in peer conversations, and those peer conversations, because we're talking about practicing language, are really quite critical. And then finally, sometimes people mistake what we call the QA, 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 QA. You know, who's the main character in the book? That's right. What did the main character do? Yes. What happened next? Exactly. And then what happened? That's right. As a conversation. That's not a true conversation. It's just a question and answer session. And when we're looking in language modeling, we want to see a true and actual dialogue. So those are basically the common coding errors for language modeling.
All right, so now we're going to talk about taking the reliability test. And there are common testing errors. One is they fail to understand what 8 weeks really means. You know, when you're in a training and you're telling people don't wait too long to start the test, they all look at you and go, okay, we won't. But really, when you need 5 to 10 hours to study for the test, that's already a week probably in everybody's busy schedule. And then we know that with the first 2 weeks, if you can get in and get the test, you have a higher chance of passing on your first go-around because the information is fresh in your mind. But if we aren't practicing or testing all in one day, I can tell by looking at scores when somebody's tested in one day. You get coder fatigue, and they tend to do really well in the first 3, a little less effective on that 4th one, and the 5th video is just a bomb. And so that really is not an effective way to take the test. And I always point that out when they're tired, usually around the 2nd day, right after the 3rd video, and we're moving into the 4th or 5th video. I remind people how they feel and have them check in with that. Another problem is not asking for help. So you take your first test, and you don't do very well. You look at your score. You try to figure out what's going on. You take the 2nd one, and you still don't pass. And then you say, oh, gosh, I'm either not going to take the 3rd round, or I'm not going to ask for help. And we just got some recent data in. I don't have the exact numbers, but we see that people who go through all 3 tries have a very high pass rate. So I think sometimes the people who have to test more than once often have a better understanding of the tool than the folks who get through the first time. I know that was clear, certainly the case for me.
And me.
And Sarah says her too. And then also forgetting to use the coding protocol, which he outlined before, and that includes looking for disconfirming evidence, and also forgetting to use the guidelines that we give them as for scoring. And really forgetting that reading the descriptor and the definitions, that's a very important piece as you weigh your evidence to decide what is that range. You have to really consider what is the description and the definition telling you to look at. So you really need to help folks understand the stress of the test and how are they going to manage their time in order to be able to take the, about 45 minutes to watch and code a video, take a break, and then get back onto the online system to test again. That's 5 hours of time, and that in our world, 5 hours of quiet time with high-speed internet and no interruption is very hard to find. So you really need to drive that idea home that they need to be practiced, and they also need to have a strategy about how they're going to take those tests.
And this is Sarah. I just wanted to jump in on a couple things. Mary Margaret talked about our data showing that the people who go on to the 3rd test have a very high pass rate, a high probability of passing. But the other thing is that people who start their testing process sooner also are more likely to pass than people who wait. And so I think that's a good message to share with your trainees. Another good message to share with your trainees relates to having them really look at the feedback, their feedback report, because their feedback report tells them about their coding tendencies. And there's a little plus mark next to each dimension, and if they click on that plus mark, it'll give them some helpful hints. And one of the things we often see is that people just take the feedback, and if they were coding too low the first time, then they go, okay, I'm going to swing in the opposite direction and code too high. And then they go, I can't get this. So if they can use that feedback, go back to their video library, go back to their justifications, go back to their manual. It will really help them better than trying to second guess the system. Okay? And then just as that reminder, knowing your resources is really important. So your class manual is definitely one of them, and use the manual every time someone asks you a question that can be answered by the manual. Teach your participants how to look up the answers to your questions by taking them to the manual. Early in the training you might say, that's a great question. Let's see what the class manual has to say about that. I'd like everyone to turn to page 26 and skim that bottom paragraph. And it's just so helpful. And it's helpful for when you get a question, even if you know the answer, you're the trainer, but you still model looking it up. So it helps them understand. Later in the training, you can respond to questions or challenges by saying, excellent question. Who can tell me where to look in the manual to find that? Or if someone makes an observation that doesn't fit, having them look in the manual and say, where would that go? And then finally, the justifications are very detailed, so we want to look at them and make sure that we use them effectively. And then finally, our last resource is the trainees. So often other trainees may be able to explain something in a way that's better than maybe you can explain it. It's just like teaching kids, where sometimes another child can show another child how to do something because they're kids. But the other reason for you, and you can tell there's always at least someone in your group, if not several people, who are with you and they're getting it. So use them as your resources, because it also helps the other trainees go, oh, wow, they're new to this too, and they're getting it, so there's hope for me if I'm struggling. So those are our suggestions in terms of using the resources. And now we've got just a few moments to look at your questions and see what we can answer.
So if you have any questions, now's the time to share them. But we do have some I can go ahead and bring up. Let me go back a little bit here.
So will the slides be available? Oh, no, I'm sorry. If we don't see transitions, we don't count that against the staff. Correct. Correct. If there are no transitions, then, yeah.
So the next question is regarding concept development and real-world examples. Should helping or connections to the real world, rather, should helping a child comprehend a new vocabulary word by connecting the new word to a previous or real-world experience count for concept development, or is it language support mature vocabulary?
We're thinking. So concept development is about an idea and helping a child develop a way to think about something on their own. So I'm not sure that would really be a connection to their real world. It would maybe be something in terms of regard, trying to see something through their point of view, supporting that relationship with the child. But concept development is really what it says. It's about helping a child develop an idea or formation of an idea. We're scanning through the question box, so give us a second if we're a little bit quiet.
Next question is, teachers often ask rote or knowledge-based questions. I've been scoring this as ILF as she is keeping them engaged. What do you think?
So yes, I would definitely think about that in terms of instructional learning formats, but I would also want to think about how effective it is, because one of the things that we talk about, so it may be more mid-range, because one of the things we talk about at the high range is that the teacher's facilitation allows the children to get more out of the activity than they would have gotten on their own. So you're right on the money in terms of thinking about it as ILF, but I'm thinking it's more mid-range. Mary Margaret?
I agree, because it's to encourage and expand their involvement. So some questions might actually expand involvement, but we're really looking to see if those questions really do get the children more engaged, more interested, and have a clearer understanding of how to use the materials or understand the activity. Another one here.
Will we? Okay, so there's one. Will we go over what to tell participants when they call for help and are very frustrated and disappointed? We're actually going to be doing a later webinar on that, on how to provide support, because the answer is longer than I can tell you right now, but the main things are to remind them, are to ask them to think about their testing situation. Did they test at the end of the day? Did they test all at once? Did they have high-speed internet that was working? And then to have them look at areas where, I always tell people where you were 3 out of 5 or less correct, to go to the video library, to watch exemplars, to read the long-range descriptions in the manual, and to read the justifications, because they give you a good idea of what we see at those ranges. But we're definitely going to be doing a webinar on exactly that topic later on. So stay tuned.
Okay. And we're just going, because we're getting short on time, we'll answer maybe a couple of more questions, but we have your questions and we will respond to them by email if we don't get back to them now. Here. There's a lot of really great questions that came through, but they're just, I think that they're really complex to answer.
We're just scrolling down trying to see which one we can hit quickly. So are we, okay, so it says, can you read it? Sarah, I can't see that part.
When you were talking about regard for student perspectives, you mentioned the teacher calling out for the children to sit on their bottoms would not be considered as rigid. Why would this not be considered as restriction of movement? I think you misheard us, because it's definitely restriction of movement. Okay.
Yeah. It was in the teacher sensitivity.
Yeah, it was the mix-up between regard for child perspectives and teacher sensitivity. So, yes, telling a child to sit on their bottom would fall under regard, lack of regard, if you will, by restricting their movement. But you can't necessarily say that a teacher telling a child to sit on their bottom and teacher sensitivity is being insensitive. They're two separate dimensions. And so if you're seeing that the children are sitting fine on their bottoms and the teacher says sit on your bottom and the children aren't wiggling, they're not uncomfortable, if there's, they're not showing a need or a problem, you would not look at it as teacher sensitivity. But I do agree that that would be a restriction.
Okay, and several people have asked about whether the slides will be available along with the recorded webinar. And the response is that the PowerPoint slides won't be available, but the recording of the webinar will. So if there's anything you need to...
No,
Well,
I mean, yeah,
you'll see
you have
the
the slides,
slides.
but you can't download them.
Right, the slides won't be downloadable. But, you can rewatch it, and if there's a slide that you're particularly interested in, the information on it, you can pause the webinar and review the questions that are, or the points that are on that page. And so I know someone had mentioned that we had moved through one a little bit quicker than and they didn't get all the information. So just know that this is going to be recorded, posted to the blog, and you'll be able to see all of the slides, pause on them, and review it that way.
And the other thing I would say is if we move on to the next slide, Caroline, it's got our email addresses. As I said, we will be working on answering all the questions that you have. But if you have additional questions, feel free to contact us. And don't everybody contact Mary Margaret because her name's first. Either one of us would be happy to work with you. And if Mary Margaret or I get overwhelmed, we'll split them up. But it is 2 o'clock, and on behalf of Mary Margaret and Caroline and myself, I'd like to thank you very much for your attendance. It was fabulous to have you here and to receive such great questions.
I can't wait to answer the questions, and I promise that we will get to it as soon as we possibly can. And we appreciate the fact that you were so interactive.
Mm-hmm. And I can attest to the fact that they love answering these types of questions.
Yes, we do. We are class geeks. Right. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.